Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the New Yankee Workshop. We get a lot of requests around here for furniture that's sized for the average home. That means small to medium pieces that you could put next to the sofa, up in the bedroom, or even in the front hallway. For quite some time, we've been looking for a small Chippendale chest, a style that's been popular for over 150 years. We just happened to find one in one of our favorite antique stores in southeastern Massachusetts. We'll go there first and show you the antique, and we'll come back here and build a 4-drawer chest next, right here in the New Yankee Workshop.
The New Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Well, once again, we're at Leonard's Antiques in Seekonk, Massachusetts, and this place is filled with antiques. You might recall that not long ago we were here looking for a canopy bed. During that time, I spied a piece that I wanted to show you today. It's a miniature 4-drawer chest, and we've been looking for a piece like this because it's just the right size to put next to a bed, where you'll have enough room for a lamp, your favorite book, and your clock radio. Now, this piece is what they call a transitional piece. It was built in 1810. This decorative foot would be Chippendale. These brasses, as well as this bead around the drawer, would be Heppel white. It's nicely dovetailed together, made out of mahogany, but what I like about it most are the proportions. I think we should build one. Well, here it is, our version of that antique chest. We're calling it a 4-drawer chest. The case and the drawer fronts are made out of hardwood mahogany plywood, edged with solid mahogany. We have these solid mahogany feet and a base molding. The drawer fronts are wrapped with this nice bead detail, and the poplar drawer box is joined to the front with these dovetail joints. We found some nice brasses, including these keyhole escutcheons, even though we didn't install any locks. If you'd like to build your version of the 4-drawer chest, a measure drawing is available with the materials list, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now, the bottom drawer sits on a piece of solid plywood. The 3 upper drawers sit on dust frames, also made out of plywood. They keep the drawer in place as it's open so it doesn't tip forward too much. I want to make those frames first. So I've ripped some pieces of AC plywood, 2.5 inches wide, some long pieces and short pieces. The long pieces get a groove. The short pieces will have a tenon. I've set up for the groove first, 1/4 inch dado, and I ran this sample. I'll run one edge through, then the other, giving me a centered groove. Before we use any power tools, however, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. For the last few minutes, I've been working on the setup to form the tenons on these short pieces. There'll be a tenon on each end. I've widened the dado to 5/8 of an inch. I've installed this sacrificial strip because it's 0 clearance. I don't want the blade to hit my good rib fence. I run the pieces through, first on one side, then the other, using my miter gauge as a guide. Now here I've set up to glue and clamp the pieces together. I'm applying a coat of glue on the tenon and in the groove with this glue brush. And just slip the pieces together. And when we get them all in, we'll clamp it. Now, purists will be outraged that I'm using plywood here instead of solid wood for these dust frames. But the plywood is much more stable. It's not going to twist like solid wood might. That way I won't have any problems with the drawers later. The clamps are just to hold the joint together while I pin it with some brads. Now for the case. The top and sides of the antique original were made out of solid mahogany. In fact, the top had a slight crack in it. That's the problem with solid material. It expands and contracts, and it can crack and twist. That's why most modern-day furniture is made out of veneer core hardwood plywoods. Here's an example of a premium piece of mahogany plywood. The core is made up of several laminations of poplar, about 1/7 of an inch thick. And each lamination has the grain running in the opposite direction. So one runs this way, one runs this way. And then there's a piece of mahogany both on the front and on the back. Now, they don't give this stuff away, but it's cheaper than solid wood, and it's more stable. Plus, you use less of the premium wood, being mahogany in this case. Now, I want to rip the two sides and the top out of this piece. I'm going to rip the sides a little bit wider than what I need so I can trim away this factory edge, which has been damaged in the shipment. The next operation is to make a rough crosscut. In this corner of the shop, we store all our woodworking jigs. And this is one we use all the time. It's our panel cutter, made out of a piece of 1/2-inch plywood with a cherry stop and a runner that fits in the miter gauge slot of the saw. Now, the reason it works so well is that this stop is absolutely 90 degrees to the saw blade. What I'll do is trim one end of my plywood, check that it's square, and then cut it to length. Okay, that's one end. Now I'll measure it for length. I want 25 1/4. Now I'll turn it around and cut the other end. Here's one of the side panels with the inside facing up. I need to make a series of dados, 3 for the dust frames and 1 for the plywood bottom. Now to do that, I'm going to use the dado in the table saw. Once again, with the sacrificial fence installed, I've run a test rabbet. Here are the two side panels opened up. I'm going to flip them together and mark this edge as the front of the chest. I open them up again, and I've designated this edge as the back of the chest. The rabbet goes along the back edge. I want it on the inside because it conceals the edge of the 1/4-inch plywood back. I don't want to make a mistake now. With the same setup, I'm going to make a rabbet in the back edge of the top to receive that plywood. The only consideration here is that the good side faces up. After some adjustments to my setup, I've just made a wider rabbet. This piece represents the top. The rabbet goes in the end of the top, so it laps over the side and it's flush. Well, now we're ready for some assembly. A little bit of glue in the dado. The solid panel goes in first. This is the bottom panel. Just drop it into the slot. This is a piece of AC plywood. I make sure that it's bottomed out in the slot. Hold a square up against the panel, and then just toenail it in place with some 1 1/4-inch brads. The dust frames get the same treatment, some glue and some brads. Now watch me closely, folks. This gets interesting. With glue in all the dados of the corresponding side, I'm going to take the whole assembly that I've built so far and try to get all the pieces into those dados. And then I'll pin it once again with some brads. Ta-da! Success. Now for the top. Some glue on the rabbet. Drop it onto the side piece. And now we'll put on a couple clamps and then we'll nail it in place. Now I'll nail through the side with some 1 1/4 inch brads. These nails will be covered by the solid trim that goes around the top. Now for the plywood back. It's a piece of 1/4 inch Luan mahogany plywood. I'm going to slip it into those rabbets and then nail it along the top edge first. Now I've drawn lines at the center of each dust frame, and I want to pin those also. It'll make the cabinet more rigid. Let's take another look at the prototype. The edges of the plywood and the front of the dust frames are covered with solid mahogany. Now when I made the pieces for the dust frames, they're a little bit narrower than the thickness of the plywood. They're flush on the bottom, but they're down just a bit on the top. And that's important because when the draw is installed and all the way in, it creates a bit of a shadow line. All these pieces are just held on with glue and brads. You might have noticed that the pieces that I applied to the end panels are wider than the thickness of the plywood. The reason for that is, by using a flush trimming bit in my router, I know that it'll be square and absolutely even with the panel. With the case upside down, I'm installing a few more strips of solid mahogany. This piece across the front will close the opening a bit, and at each edge I'll have another piece which is going to help guide the draw as it's pulled out. This plywood filler strip goes right along the front edge of the bottom shelf, and it brings the shelf even with the side panel. Let's take another look at the prototype. The case sits on some feet. The front feet are mitered on the corners. The back is just a single foot with a plywood brace. So I've cut some solid mahogany to the right height, and I have a template to lay out the shape. Now I have to cut the miters before I cut the shape, otherwise it'll be difficult to hold. So I've simply set my table saw at 45 degrees, and I'll use my miter gauge to guide it through. Just glue and brads on this miter joint do not make it very strong. What I like to do is cut slots in each miter for a number 20 biscuit. That'll add a lot of strength. But additionally, when I put this on the case, I'm going to add these glue blocks right on the inside corner. The legs sit just under the edge of the case. I've made these glue blocks to locate them, and I'll just pin them with a couple little brads. All right, with glue spread in the biscuit slots and on the biscuit, I can put these two pieces together. No nails for the moment. We'll just slide that together, make sure it's nice and even. Now I can add some glue to the bottom of the case and the side of that glue block that I just installed a couple seconds ago. And we'll bring the whole assembly to that and pin it with the brad. Okay, and now plenty of glue on that glue block that I showed you earlier. Drop it in the inside corner and pin it with a couple brads. Now that block with the notch fits over the side and meets the leg. These marks are for biscuit slots. Now this is such an important step. How many pieces of furniture have you seen that have a broken off back leg because it didn't have a proper brace? Okay, that takes care of the feet. Now we want to cover the top of the foot with that base molding, but first I have to make it. I'll show you how. I've installed a 3/8" radius router bit in my router table. I'm starting with 1/2" thick stock. I'm going to run the profile on each edge and then rip a couple pieces of molding. Now with a little glue on the molding and the miter, bring them together and secure everything with some 1" brads. There's one more thing I want to do before I leave tonight, and that is to wrap the draw fronts. Each draw front is a piece of 3/4" plywood, and the wrap that goes around it is a piece of 1/8" thick solid mahogany. I want to round over the edge of the mahogany. I'll do that at the router station. The width of all the draws is the same, so I made a little jig to cut those beaded pieces. It just slips up against my standard miter gauge, and it also gives me some backing as I run these pieces through to prevent tear out. On the other end, I installed this stop block so all the pieces will be the same length. So with the saw tipped to 45 degrees, I can cut the pieces. Okay, a little glue rolled on the edge, and I flip it down on my table. That way I know the piece will be flush to the back. Check the joint, and we'll just attach the long pieces with some 5/8 brads. Now the ends are attached with glue only, no nails. I don't want them to get in the way of the dovetailing, which we'll be doing tomorrow. Well, good morning. Last night I finished edging all the plywood draw fronts, and before we get to the draws, there's one more thing I want to do to the case. The top, of course, is a piece of veneer plywood, and it's edged with this solid mahogany band. I want to make that first at the router table. Now I want to just knock off a bit of these top corners. So I'm going to hit it with a block plane and then sand it smooth. With a little bit of glue on the molding, I can set it on the case. Now I'm holding it down slightly to create a little bit of a reveal. And even though that exposes a bit of the core of the plywood, that'll disappear when I stain the piece. Okay, that takes care of the case. Let's make some draws. The box for the draw is made up of 1/2" poplar, not plywood. I've set up the side in my dovetailing jig for half-blind dovetails. You've seen us do this before. Well, that takes care of the tailboard. With the draw front mounted in the top of the jig, I'm ready to cut the pins. And because I have that thin piece of banding that wraps the draw, I found the best way to prevent tear out is to take a solid piece of material and back it up, cutting through both pieces. All the draw parts get a 1/4-inch groove for the plywood bottom. That groove in the side is for the back of the draw. I've applied glue both to the tails and the sockets, and we'll just tap those together. Now that's a strong joint and it's beautiful. Plywood bottom slips in dry. Put the back on and nail it up. Well, there's one more milling operation that I have to do here in the shop to the draw front. I need a mortise for the key escutcheons. I took a piece of 1/4-inch plywood and cut out a piece about 1/8 of an inch bigger than the escutcheon itself. And that's to account for the difference between the collar and the bit that I'm using in my router. That takes care of the mortise. Then to put the escutcheon in, I just set it in the hole and take my clamp and press it into place. That's all there is to it. I'd say this piece is ready for the finishing room. The antique that we saw was very dark, and we're trying to accomplish the same thing. I'm using a dark mahogany stain. Put a nice heavy coat on it and let it thoroughly penetrate the wood. For the protective coats, I'm using a wipe-on poly. It's a gloss finish that I just put on with a rag. Gives it a hand-rubbed look. I can put on another coat in 3 hours after a light sanding with 220 grit paper. 3 coats should do it. Well, after several coats of that wipe-on poly, we're ready for the brasses, which we picked up from a specialty hardware store. They're actually an exact match to the ones on the antique. That's nice. I think this piece is destined to become a family heirloom.